I sit here in my old creaking office chair and write this with a somewhat heavy heart. My Uncle Henry passed away this morning at exactly 10:05 a.m. He was a good man, and I'll always remember him for being easygoing and sort of a familiar stability in my childhood. And he was always there to lend an ear and some country wisdom in his later years. When childhood had long since become a shadow of present, and life's follies and pitfalls had become more serious in their outcome, I can still picture him now, standing outside the old red barn in the back of the farmhouse, hands jammed deep in his pockets of his faded khaki pants, and a slanted smile on his lean, weathered face. The service is on Saturday at the very same church where Gramps and Grandma used to drag families on Sunday. He wasn't a religious man in life, but I know that he'd want a church service. Not to satisfy his own wishes, but for the others, the older members of our dwindling family who were raised in the terror of the Romanian Lutheran Church. He'd know that it would settle their fears of their own looming mortality to see his remains consecrated in a manner that their version of God deemed as being right and proper. I can almost hear him now, sitting in his handmade bench seat rocking chair and grinning up at me in a haze of smoke from the Players Unfiltered. What the fuck do I care, he'd laugh. I'm dead. Let them watch their preacher do his song and dance routine over my corpse. Why not? If it makes them feel better, then no harm done. Old Henry, dead at 84 of a stroke, the big brother of a previous stroke which had left the poor guy wheelchair bound for about over a year before his death. After the first one, he had to leave the farm to take permanent residence at the old folks' home outside of town. Although he hadn't lost any of his mental faculties, when the initial stroke had felled him in his study, Henry just wasn't the same anymore in that nursing home. You could see it in his eyes and hear it in his quavering voice. Hell, you could feel it. There was really just no vitality left. There was no more stories and jokes while Henry's there. Just polite, strained conversation about the various mundane affairs of day-to-day life. These visits always left me feeling a little depressed, and I hope that Henry is happier now wherever he may be. In honor of his memory, I'd like to retell a story that Henry had shared with me over a case of beer. While sitting around and shooting the shit on a hot summer's day afternoon, it got under my skin then, and it still does to this very day. Stories like this make me wonder, sometimes, how much do we really know about the natural world around us? The deep woods are much like the primordial forests of the human psyche, both dense with gloom and shadows. Who's to say what might lurk in the inky depths? It was about a year and a half ago. We were right in the middle of a long, humid Elgin County summer. I remember that we were hiding in the shade of a big oak that dominates his side yard, sitting in a large wooden recliner that Henry had made himself long ago, back in a year when the Beatles were not yet even a rumor over the side of the pond. We were drinking a few cold beers and discussing all the world and everything in it, just pissing away a Sunday afternoon. The discussion then veered, as it sometimes did with Henry, into the realm of the very strange. He just finished telling me about the UFOs that he'd seen back in '55, right over the fucking meadow, down the valley in front of us, as it just hovered there like it was on a string, bright as day and totally silent. Why, oh why did you not get a picture of this, Henry, I demanded. It just hovered there for minutes on end, not 200 yards away, and the house is like 20 feet behind us. You know, you could have, I began. As I was told to shut your hole, you speak as though you wouldn't have been frozen in place with a lump sliding out your back door, which is pretty much what happened, truth be told. Sometimes a man just freezes. Call it cowardice, fear, common sense, whatever. Every man has a moment or three in his life when he freezes up solid in the face of action. Just happens, champ. You'll be a man someday, and then you'll understand. Okay, sure, but you saw a huge UFO, and you didn't get a picture of it, even though you had a camera nearby. What else could you have snapped a picture of? Sasquatch? A chupacabra? Hey, I don't know what might be in these woods. Well, maybe not now, but once upon a time, these woods were thick and wild. Half the farms on this road didn't exist yet in the late 40s. Just acres and acres of woods and gullies. All kinds of shit used to live out here. All kinds. Yeah? Like what? I asked. You ever shoot something exotic in the face? Henry considered this. He was suddenly quite serious. In a manner of speaking, yeah, I have. He looked at me for a long moment, and his lean, weathered face bore a look of somber consideration. His eyes had lost their customary sparkle of good humor, and quite abruptly the warm feeling of familiar camaraderie was gone from the air between us. Henry looked about as serious as I'd ever seen him look. It made me feel a little uneasy, as our conversation was a small, unsteady boat that was about to enter rough waters of the unknown, and sometimes Henry's stories could do that. He exhaled long and slow and said, "So anyways, I woke up one early Saturday morning back in the fall of '47, I think it was late September, and I says to myself, fuck it, I'm going rabbit hunting. The valley down there was always teeming with them, and there were like zillions of these little buggers out in the woods around us too. You could hunker down in the scrub where the woods border the cornfields and pop all kinds of rabbits if you're patient. A smile ghosted his lips, then was gone. Rabbit stew, man. I love it. Your grandma made great rabbit stew. Anyway, so I was back near the end of the property with my .22, waiting and watching as the sun rose up over the trees, when I saw someone come staggering up out of the gully. Even at the distance I was from him, I could see that whoever it was hurt real bad. He was limping something awful, leaning on a stick to keep himself from falling over into the dirt. Something was wrong with his face. I didn't run over to him right away. I just sat and watched him limp and hobble out of the morning mist for about a minute or so. I felt frozen in place. I felt like this guy was bringing something out of the woods with him, something dark and, well, bad. I felt like he was bringing something and was probably going to change the way I saw my little corner of the world forever. Then the stick he was leaning on snapped and he fell down, maybe 40 yards away from me. He kind of flopped face first into the edge of the field, didn't even try to put his hands out to stop his fall. I ran over to see if I could help him, but I kept my rifle in hand, you know? As soon as I got close, I seen two things right away. First, this guy was native, and I saw that he was bleeding out from his front. The blood was leaking out from underneath him really fast, staining the sandy dark dirt all around him. The old denim overalls that he was wearing were soaked right through. Right away, I knew that this guy was done for. You can't lose that much blood and live. I popped off a cap on another beer and leaned forward in my chair. Yikes, man. Jesus. So what'd you do? Well, I put down my gun and rolled him over and shit, what a mess. I almost puked. His face was tore open on one side. I mean, one part of his face was literally just hanging off the skull by a few threads of skin. I could see the skinny red ropes of muscle in his cheek and the yellow row of teeth on the side of his jaw. The eye socket was completely in ruin, and I mean, it was an absolute mess. His coveralls were ripped in a bunch of places, and the meat was mangled underneath. The native fella had been mauled just horribly, and he was dying right in front of me. There wasn't a single damn thing I could do except grab his hand and ask him what happened. Uncle Henry reached down into the old cooler that sat between us and pulled an OV out of the melting ice. He cracked the cap slowly and took a sip. I was gaping at him, feeling somewhat incredulous. How could it be that I've never heard this story before? Henry continued. I said, Jesus, what has done this to you, man? The native guy opened his mouth to speak, but the tendons in his side were just all messed up in his jaw, and they were pretty much tore open. And something let go when he tried to talk. I actually heard the damn thing snap. There was this little pop, and then suddenly his lower jaw just was kind of flapping around, open and useless. He was struggling to sit up, thrashing around the wet dirt in front of me. I tried my best to make him be still, but the poor bastard was having some kind of fit, and I knew he was on his way out. Right then and there. The blood was still running out of him, but a lot slower. I could tell he was just about to bleed out. The guy's body got really rigid for a few seconds, and then he shuddered and collapsed back down onto the ground. His good eye rolled up into the back of his head, and his breathing got labored. It sounded like an old car with a rattling valve stem and a rusted out muffler. The guy's heels drummed against the ground, he shit himself, and then he kind of crumpled down and was still in the dirt. Henry stopped to light a smoke and coughed, harsh and dry. One drag closer to bursting a blood vessel in his brain, he said. I leaned in closer to check if he was still breathing. The guy's arm suddenly shot out and grabbed me by the shoulders with a grip like iron. He pulled me in closer, stared into my face with his remaining eye. It was full of pain and fear, a lot of fear. He tried real hard to whisper something to me, something in his language, but his jaw, well, he couldn't really form the words. But it sounded like he was saying N-E-O over and over, urgently. He was dying, and he was trying so hard to make me understand, but I couldn't. I says to him, "What the hell are you trying to tell me, man? I don't understand you." But the good eye had already stopped looking at anything in particular. The native fellow was dead, and the last of his life's blood all over my arms and pant legs. Shit, Henry. I mean, wow. What did you do then? Call the police, I guess? You guessed correctly. When I made sure that the man was no longer drawing breath, I hightailed it back to the house. I tried to tell your grandma and grandpa what had happened, but they couldn't make any sense of my blabbering. So Ma sits me down for a mug of tea with rum, and Dad jumps into the old 34 Chevy flatbed that we used around the farm. Now that truck was a real bitch, but she had a motor back in the day. Hell yes, I remember that your grandpa had screwed a heavy lattice-style rail on the other side of the bed so that we wouldn't go flying out at the corners when he took us all in the fields in the morning. Henry, you're getting sidetracked. Yeah, I'm getting there. Paul races out with the old truck and comes back 15 minutes later looking grim. He asked me to call the cops. You remember your grandpa. His accent was so thick that not a single soul could understand the man. So I go and get on the horn, and I remember that I had to ask Mrs. Greer to get off the party line. She was stone deaf but always on the fucking phone. So I make the call, tell him that there's been an animal attack or something, and a man is dead on our property. "Do you know the deceased?" the desk cop asked me, and I say, "No, sir, I don't know who this is. It's a native fella. I don't really know his name." Well, there was a long pause, and the cop says, "Okay, then don't go anywhere. We'll send someone out there in a while. No hurry," I said. "Hell, there's a man been killed out there. Why wouldn't you hurry?" And the bastard says, "A dead native, right? It's not your sweetheart or your grandma, buddy, so just relax. He ain't gonna be any deader on us, so yeah, no hurry. Try to keep your dogs and such off him in the meantime, sir, if you could, and we'll be out there when we get there. Thanks." And then he hung up on me. As much as I didn't want to believe this, I could, because consideration for basic human rights of native peoples has really been a real concern for the Canadian government or their minions. I nodded stiffly for my uncle to continue. "Different times, kiddo. It was different times. Not that anything has really changed, I guess. Anyhow, it took them hours to get there. So in the meantime, me and Dad went out and covered the poor bastard up with old sheets of canvas. When we get back, we didn't know what to do with ourselves. So we sat right there, just sitting and waiting for the cops to get out there. We didn't talk much about what might have happened to the guy. Your grandpa muttered something about a wolf, and I nodded. And we both know a wolf didn't do that to him. It was something else, and I was kind of scared, and I think your grandpa was too. Did you know where the dead guy was from, or did you have any clue who he was?" I asked. "Oh, we had a good idea where he was from," Henry replied. He fished another smoke out of his rumpled, battered pack. He considered it, and then lit it. "He had to be from 55, which was the local native reserve. Where else?" "Wait," I interrupted. "There's no native reserve anywhere near here. The closest one is Muncie. But it's not actually a res. No, there has never been an official reserve around here. But there are certainly more than a few unofficial communities like that. Well, back in those days anyways. The 55 was one of them. That's what we just called it. Just the 55. I have no idea what the people themselves called it. See, there used to be this really narrow, rough little road off of Country Road 55 that led into the woods, and eventually to a big clearing. Maybe 12 or so families lived out there. They didn't have any electricity or oil furnaces. They had chickens running around as they pleased, and there were corn liquor stills in the woods behind those little houses. They had been displaced from way up north a long time ago, and when they got down here in the late 1800s, the locals didn't really treat them that well, and as a kid, I overheard the grown-ups tell stories of forced head shavings with a straight razor, or beatings, or arson. The authorities just sort of turned a blind eye to it. Could be that some of them even got into the action themselves. Again, I nodded at this, because despite what people say, not all law enforcement officers are bad, not by a long shot. However, there are a lot that can be far from good. The late 1940s was not really an enlightened time, especially not in rural Canada. A certain amount of xenophobia was the norm back then. Hell, it might still be to this day. Henry nodded back at me sourly. The cops showed up just before noon. They looked bored and hot. We took them out in the truck where the body was. The flies were buzzing around it. Something terrible. They looked at it, prodded it with the toe of their shiny leather shoes, and then one of them says, "Yep, that's a dead native, all right. Goddamn, he is messed up, isn't he?" It was like they were looking at a dead buck on the side of the road. It was mostly just a mess to clean up. They didn't bother taking any pictures of the crime scene or calling in a forensics guy or a coroner or anything. They just threw the tarp back over the body and started rolling him up in it. I felt ashamed by them, you know? The way they were doing things wasn't right or good, I guess. Your grandpa watched them doing it and he got mad and said, "Hey, that's a man there, just like you. What's wrong with your mothers that raised you to be such goats?" I smirked and Henry gave a dry-throated, rusty little chuckle. It was Grandpa, all right. Small and fiery, hard and righteous. Yeah, Dad was a tough little bastard. He said what was on his mind no matter what. He was forcefully conscripted into the Kaiser's army in World War I. You know that? Yep, the missing finger got cut off by an American bayonet. So that's what happened to it. Wow, that's fucking crazy. I never actually knew that. I slugged down some more of the good cold brew and swiped the bottle against my forehead. Did the cops understand what Gramps had said to them? Nope, but they understood by his tone and body language that they were getting cussed out and they weren't too happy about it. I apologized and said that he was just mad because they had to take a day off and wait for them to get there, and there was work that needed to be done. Cops glared at us and told us to pull our truck over closer, and then heave the dead native's body into the bed and made us drive it back to their squad car. They took some stuff off the squad car's trunk and then made room, for the body, and just tossed it in there like it was garbage. I suppose it was, to them. We both sat quietly for a minute or two, thinking and sipping our beers. Man, the world can be shitty sometimes, can't it? We should all be ashamed of the outrages that we allow to exist within it, all of us. After supper was done and squared away, we had a visitor, the Dutchman who owned the orchard down the road. He was white round up, talking about a mile a minute. There were rumors spreading around that there had been multiple murders out at the 55 the night before, an entire family slaughtered and ripped to pieces. Johann Brubeck and some of the hired hands found them around this afternoon while out on a run to buy some moonshine. No one who lived there knew anything about it, or that was what they were claiming anyways. An entire family murdered in the dead of night, and not a soul had heard a sound. The guy you found out by the field must have escaped from the shack while the killers were still having at it. It gave me a shiver to know that I had seen a murder victim breathe his last breath. I started to tell old Van Klein about him, but your grandpa cut me off and glared at me. I asked him why later on, and he told me to save it for the police because they would probably be back soon. It wasn't just one dead native anymore. It was a multiple murder. There was going to be an investigation for sure. That night, I slept like shit, tossing and turning, and when I finally did fall asleep, something woke me up with a start. I sat up and listened hard. Something was, I don't know, kind of howling and screaming, and maybe even laughing too. Something far out in the woods. I had my 22 in my room with me, and I curled up in my sweaty sheets with it clutched in my hands, and I barely slept another wink that night. It wasn't just a coyote? Nah, it wasn't just a coyote. Think I don't know what a coyote sounds like? Henry was feeling dry. He finished his beer in a few long gulps, his grizzled neck pumping up and down as he swallowed. He grunted gratefully and continued. The next day, old Van Klein came back to see us. He waited till Ma had left the kitchen for some reason, then he told us that another murder had taken place out of the 55. An older guy, no wife or kids, in the house. The killer took his head clean off, and the old fella was gutted. The head and guts were completely missing. I said, "Get the fuck out of here. This happened?" "Yep, it happened." That night I sat up with Dad and kept watch over the farm. We both had a gun in our lap. The next day the cops came back out. They didn't send some dumbass patrolman this time either. It was a detective with the RCMP, wearing a suit and tie, the whole deal. He asked us a lot of questions and some were really peculiar. For example, he asked us if we knew of any mental cases that lived around the area. You know, simpletons and folks that were touched in the head. He also asked if we had ever seen any evidence of a cougar or maybe some other big cat on our property. I told him about this god-awful caterwauling I had heard the night before, and he had me describe exactly what it sounded like. I mentioned to him that the native fella had tried to tell me something right before he died, and the Mountie had me try and sound out what I had heard him say. When he was climbing back into the car to leave, he stopped for a moment and told us to stay indoors at night and to keep our firearms on hand. He was the most serious-looking man I had ever seen. His eyes looked right through you, and believe me, you wouldn't hide nothing from this guy. No way. A couple days after that, the Dutchman comes over early one morning, and he's scared and he's mad. He told us that something had tried to break through his back door the night before. He woke up to the sound of his dogs howling and yipping. Hell, all of his animals were making racket. The rooster and the goat, the whole fucking barnyard, bleating and barking and hollering away. You could hear glass breaking and the screech of metal being twisted. Old Willie came downstairs in his nightshirt and blasted a hole through our own back door with a shotgun. He didn't hit the thing that was on the other side, but he did scare it off. He told us that the fucker howled like a banshee as it ran into the apple trees, and the sound made the hairs on the back of Willie's neck stand on end. Van Glide told us that he had waited until he was absolutely sure that the thing had gone before he came out to check the damage to his door. He sounded ashamed when he said that, embarrassed, but defiant too. Willie was a big, rough old character, and he had been scared. Well, then I guess I would have been terrified. When we came outside, he called to his dogs, but they wouldn't come out of hiding. As for the door, whatever it was had managed to scare old Willie's entire farm shitless. It was also strong as hell. It had pried this heavy screen door back like it was a fucking thing made out of tinfoil. There were deep gouges in the wooden door frame, marks that had been left by claws. Van Klein didn't manage to catch a glimpse of the thing through the window. It was too fast, but he found a few tracks that were left behind in a soft muddy spot in his barnyard. He asked us to come see them. Like I said, the man was really upset, just about vibrating. We dropped what we were doing and went over to his place, and I'll tell you what, man, it wasn't any kind of animal that I had ever seen around these parts that left those tracks behind. No sir, they were kind of like a man's footprint, but a lot longer. They were wider at the ball of the foot and narrowed around the heel. There were only 4 toes, and each one was tipped with a claw at least 3 inches long. We stared at the prints for a long while, your grandpa and me. They scared us. Henry saw the look on my face and snorted. Don't believe me? Shit on you, bucko. I might be old and feeble-headed, but I remember those tracks just as clearly as breakfast this morning. They looked like something a gargoyle might leave behind. They could have been faked easily enough, sure, but we knew that they weren't. There were clots of dirt scattered in the grass behind the muddy patch, chunks of earth that were flung back from this thing as it kept charging through. Even the depth and angle at which these prints were set into the ground could have been faked, but it wasn't. Not to mention the damage to the screen door, it was almost bent in two, just hanging there by the bottom hinge. This was back in the day when things weren't really made out of flimsy aluminum, mind you. Some men might be strong enough to do something like that, but not very damn many. I held my hands up in a placating sort of way, say, okay, fine, they were real, we'll go with that. What happened next? I'll tell you what happened next. Us and Willie decided we weren't just gonna wait around on the cops or the game warden anymore. So we got a hunting party together, or really a lynch mob, whatever you want to look at it, I guess. Van Klein and me made some phone calls and face-to-face visits, and we ended up with 9 guys. It was me, your dad, your grandpa, Grandpa, Willie Van Clyne, his son Frederick, and his brother Randolph, and a local character from Calton named Bill Walsh, along with 2 Frenchmen farmhands that were over drinking with Bill in his garage when we came calling on him. Every one of us was armed with a rifle, and Bill had a service pistol in his shoulder holster. We got everyone together at old Willie's place and set out on following this thing's trail. I remember that Bill was following behind us a little ways back, huffing and sweating and complaining about his heart. He told us, "You fellers up there can soften the son of a bitch up for me, then I'll finish him off." The rest of us laughed a little too hard at that. I'll tell you, we were strung tight, man. Tight like a goddamn piano wire. I'll tell you something, Henry. There's no fucking way I would have gone out looking for this thing. Maybe in a tank. Henry grunted in a negative manner and said, "Yeah, you would've. You know why? Because it was getting after our own, and a man instinctively won't tolerate danger to his own. I'll tell you something, young feller. The dirty 30s left us all with a strong sense of family and community, not like today. It also left us hardened to the plight of strangers. I know that sounds bad when you say it aloud, but when that thing was preying on natives out in 55, well, it was horrible business, sure, but they weren't our own. Now, old Van Clyne, he was one of ours. His kin had lived and worked on the orchard since really the invention of the automobile. We'd visit the family on Christmas Day, and we'd also help take in each other's harvest. I know it's hard to imagine now, but the land around was still pretty wild back then. There was nothing but bush for miles and miles around us. Most of these roads were still laid with loose gravel and even dirt. All of us farmers and such, well, we knew each other, and we looked out for each other. Because otherwise, we'd just be little specks of humanity here and there. Just little pockets of people. All of us lost in the wilderness. It's hard to comprehend nowadays, but back then it was a reality. Henry gulped down some more beer in his grizzled neck and then flapped a hand at me dismissively. "Nah, you would have been there with us, I'm sure of it. Because a man takes care of his own, whether he wants to or not. Any man worth being called a man, anyhow." I thought about this and nodded. If I felt that my family was being menaced, I'd take action. Scared shitless or not. Sure I would, because love is stronger than fear. None of us were the world's greatest trackers, but this thing was big, man. It didn't look like a fucker that had really been concerned about leaving a trail when it was running away from Van Clyne's Remington either. We follow the tracks and scuffs in the grass to the barnyard, past the chicken coop. Your dad says, "Hey, you know what's peculiar to me? Your dogs were hiding from the son of a bitch, right? And here's the chicken coop. It didn't go after them. I seen what it done to your door. It could have got into the hen house, no problem. What kind of predator just strolls right past the coop and tries to break into a house?" Well, that spooked us pretty good, because no one had considered that. The bastard had gone straight for the Van Clynes and ignored their livestock completely. It was more than just peculiar, it was really downright scary. We followed the trail into the apple orchard. There were branches broken off here and there, wherever the thing had pushed itself through a row of trees. The height that they were broken at, though, this bastard was huge, at least 7 feet high. And it was wider than 2 men standing side by side, and strong. I mean, damn, this thing was powerful. Some of the branches it broke off were 4 or 5 inches thick, and it just snapped them like toothpicks. Broke the bastards clean off without a second thought. We followed the trail through the orchard and into a meadow, and then into the woods. Deep, deep into the woods. We trudged through the wet marsh and cluster of thorny vines, through the shallow streams in and out of gullies. Eventually someone realized that we must be near the 55, and sure enough, after a few more minutes, we began to see a clearing ahead. After a few minutes, we emerged and saw a ring of a bunch of piss-poor houses leaning out of the ground like tombstones. They were arranged in a sort of rough circle, and in the middle, there was a big community fire pit. When we come into the circle, there were just a few men sitting around a low fire in the pit, sitting on the ground and staring at us like they were expecting us. Bill Walsh was the one to approach them, as he sort of knew them, being a customer of the moonshine trade and all. Bill said, "We're sorry to disturb you fellers. We truly are. God's mercy on your dead. That's a hell of an awful thing. But we've been tracking something through the bush today, and the trail led us here. I think you know what we've been tracking. Did anything happen around here last night?" Did. And then a big guy with a scar on his cheek and long hair interrupts him and says, "We know what you're doing, and we think you're a bunch of jackasses. Get the fuck off our land, white men, and don't come back until you've got money in your pockets for liquor. This is not a time for your people to be coming out here playing at being great white hunters. People are grieving here, do you get it? You're just wasting our time out here anyways. You won't find anything you're looking for, not in the daytime, and sure as hell, none of you dummies want to run into this at night. You come onto our land with loaded guns, fuck off and beat it." Well, your dad, shit, you know your dad, war hero and all, drunk all the time, angry and ready to fight, he yelled, "What the hell did you just say to us? How about I put this loaded gun down and then kick your rotten lungs right the fuck out of you? You talk to me like that again, and that's exactly what's gonna happen. I'll knock your dick into the dirt." He was walking towards the fire pit with your grandpa trying to pull him back, and the native with the scarred face was already up on his feet with his fists raised, and suddenly, boom! We all jump and whirl around, and it's Willie Van Clyne, standing there with his shotgun pointed in the air and all his weathered old face set like stone. Willie stepped up and he said, "I won't be going home just yet. Something tried to rip its way into my house last night, my house, where my wife and kids sleep. We tracked it here. I'm sorry for your kinfolk, but I think someone here knows what's going on, and I want to talk to that someone." The men around the fire stared at us some more, and the big old boy with the scars snorts some mean laughter and says, "You people are always giving orders, always demanding things. You want to know what's going on? You wouldn't even begin to understand. The Wendigo wears human skin and lives in the house beside you. He has 2 lives, one in the light and one in darkness. He'll wave to you while you're washing your car Sunday morning, and then come to you at night and eat your guts from your body while you're still alive. You know what you should all go do? Go home and pray to God. It's what your people do when you're scared, right? Go pray to him, and don't come back." I could see it in my mind's eye, a circle of men facing each other in the clearing, a sputtering little fire separating the racial lines. I could see the stoic faces peering out the cracked windows, watching the showdown from the tar paper shacks in the background. Well, there's silence for a minute, dead silence, just us and them facing each other, with not a sound in the air except the mosquitoes. Then, all of a sudden, there was this older character standing in the middle of us. Kinda just popped up from nowhere. It was the weirdest thing. The old guy was tall, had long white hair in a braid, and he looked like an older version of the Scarface guy. I prayed to our ancestors when we lost our home. I prayed again when they sent me to live with a Cree family who I'd never seen before in my life when I was done. And I prayed one last time to whoever might be listening that this curse might be lifted from this land and we might live without fearing the night. And my prayer was answered with death. Some of the dead were our children. My grandnephew was one of them. He was only 8. He shook his head and wiped his tears, and I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't ever think that some of the dead might have been kids. Although I guess I should have. I mean, Jesus, man, I can't imagine it. Kids being murdered like that. I don't think any decent person really could. Pretty soon, the chief strangled back his tears and got himself under control, and he croaked, "There has been death here, and there might still be more. But I won't be saddened by it because my heart has already been broken. Prayers won't help you, white man. As far as I can tell, prayers never really helped anyone." Man, his eyes were nothing but pain. And looking into those eyes took the fight out of everybody. Even your dad was looking like he felt awful for this guy. I piped up to him and said, "We're all sorry about your loss. One of yours made it all the way back to our farm after he got attacked. And I tried to make his final moments as comfortable as I could. I won't pretend to know what you're all going through. We only came out here today because something was trying to get into Mr. Van Clyne's house last night, and we think it might be the same critter that has been attacking your people. We followed its trail today, and it led us here. This thing came right through your homestead last night, and no one saw it?" The old chief looked at me hard, and I could see that he wasn't just angry and grieving, he was deathly afraid too. We were all scared shitless, every one of us. And I think that none of our little hunting party really wanted to hear what the old chief was about to say to us. Henry paused to fish another beer out of the slushy water in the cooler. And I realized that I was dry now too. The breeze had picked up a little, and I told myself that it was just my drying sweat that made me shiver. Sure it was. Henry grimaced a little bit at the feel of the cold carbonation hitting his parched neck, then motioned at me with a bottle. So the chief says to us, "It comes every night for 2 weeks running. It looks into our windows and scratches bad symbols onto our doors. This thing is not an animal from the natural world. It's a Wendigo. A person who is sick in his heart and in his mind. So sick that the evil of the spirit leaves his body in despair. What's left isn't human anymore. He looks and behaves like a man in the day, but at night he transforms into a monster. The Wendigo eats only raw human flesh." We were all grown men, rational men, some of us war veterans and all of us survivors. But deep down, we were still peasant immigrants, and from the most part, farmers and sons of farmers from the rural darklands of Europe. Most of us grew up hearing bedtime stories about the horrible creatures that lurk in the woods and live in the night. We grew up being told that science and magic can coexist, and the natural world is full of unnatural things. We believe what this man said with mortal fear in his eyes. "Give me a smoke, would you? I got another pack, but it's in my truck." I did, and Henry lit up a tarnished old Zippo. I watched this impatiently. I was literally sitting on the edge of my seat, hauling on my own cigarette with deep, anxious anticipation. Your dad was staring hard at the old fellow. He said, "Is it one of you sons of bitches that's been doing it? Which one of you is it? Come on, Chief, you know, don't you? Tell me who it is, and I'll kill the motherfucker right now. I'll plant him 6 feet in the ground." The chief just snorted without any humor and told him, if it were one of our own, his head would have long ago been buried in the creek bed, his body turned to ashes. "No, white man, this devil is one of yours. Now get off this land. Get off and don't come back. You have no business here, you never did." Well, he had a point, I guess. We left, and it was going to be dark soon, and none of us really wanted to still be out in the bush when the sun slipped past the horizon, all bravado aside. We followed our own trail home. We were trudging along, and Rudolph was up front, of the rest of us. Yeah, it was poor old Rudy who got the worst of it. All of a sudden he hollers up the sky and drops like a stone into dead leaves and pickerweeds, then screams again, loud as you can imagine. His brother and his nephew come running over to him, and then Frederick is hollering too, jumping up and down on one foot and yelling, "Oh shit!" Everyone stop in their tracks right now and look at this. And we see that there is a big, dirty old 6-inch spike sticking out of the bottom of Freddy's shoe. Big Rudy got it even worse. The spike had gone clear through the foot and punctured 2 inches out the top of his boot. When he fell on his ass, another spike had pierced his inner thigh, and this one was really bad. It nicked an artery, and Rudy was bleeding like a mad bastard. 10 seconds and the poor guy's pant leg was soaked clear through to his ankle. Your dad yells, "Quick, someone give me their belt." I gave him mine and he looped it around Rudy's big old tree trunk leg right under his groin and then pulled it tight and tied it there. Rudy was starting to lose consciousness from the shock and blood loss, but he managed to slur out, "Stuck him in the fucking ground, booby-trapped us, followed behind us and done it, the dirty fuckers." We dragged the big bugger a little ways and leaned him up against a tree. He was out of it. His eyes were rolling back into his head and such. Your dad was fit to be locked up in a straitjacket. He was just about foaming at the mouth, wanting to go back and shoot up the 55 like it was a German machine gun nest or something. He was convinced that it was one of theirs that had done Rudolph and Freddy like that. Willie the Frenchman and your grandpa had to restrain him by force. They wrestled him off his feet and piled on top of him. And they wouldn't get up till he promised to calm the hell down. Goddamn idiot. Well, now we had a problem, alright. We had 2 men down, and one of them was in a bad way. Frederick yanked the nail out of his foot no problem, but he was limping real bad. Rudy wasn't in any condition to walk. We had to get the hell out of the woods before dark, and not one of us was about to admit it out loud, but we were all scared shitless as the sun was starting to set, and we were still out there. Henry gave me a slanted smile and pointed at me with his cigarette. You know, a man can sit and bullshit all he wants about how he doesn't believe in the boogeyman when it's day like today, with the sun shining bright and a warm breeze blowing. Everything all around you is hunky-dory as normal, and it's easy to be brave. But it's a different story when you find yourself in a situation like this one. I felt ready to jump out of my skin. Whatever it was that we had tracked into the woods, well, it was likely stalking us now. And it was trying to keep us there, and it was really just stalling us until the sun went down. So Louis and the other Quebec fella, I can't really remember his name, they built a pretty passable travois with branches, some twine, belts, and whatever else we had to use on hand. We put Rudy on it and then strapped him up by his suspenders. Poor Freddy had a branch with one end wrapped around his shirt, and that was his crutch. Fuck, it was slow going. Too slow. The sun was starting to set on us, and the woods were getting dark fast. Dad, your grandpa, he had the forethought to bring out a flashlight. Willie too. And we made a few torches with the dead branches and our torn off shirt tails soaked in Zippo lighter fluid. It was getting cool out, but really every one of us was sweating buckets. We were nowhere near the edge of the woods, and the very last of the day's light was fading out of the sky. I was pulling Rudy on the travois with Willie, and we needed to stop for a second to catch our breath. The old bastard was heavy. While we were stopped, we decided it'd be useless to try to find our way out of the bush in the dark. We just ended up going in circles and getting disorientated. The best bet was to stay put and build a fire and just sort of wait to see if anyone was going to come looking for us. So me and your dad built a good-sized fire, and when it was roaring, we all crowded around it like scared kids on their first campout. We dragged Rudy close to the fire too, so that we could sort of keep an eye on him. He was in and out of consciousness, and it wasn't looking too good for him. We started talking about the Wendigo story and whether or not it was bullshit. Some of the guys were starting to think that maybe your pop was right, and it was just someone out at the 55 that was responsible for all the murders and mayhem. Me and the rest of us, well, we weren't really so sure. So we're all sort of arguing in loud whispers, and it starts getting heated. Suddenly, Lewis looks around and says, "Tabernacle. Where the fuck has Billy gone to?" We all look around and yep, Bill Walsh is nowhere to be seen. He ain't standing there like the rest of us, and maybe he hadn't ever been there in the first place. At some point, Billy just vanished into thin air. Henry finished his beer in one go, swallowing mechanically, just getting it down so that he could crack open another. His eyes were roomy and distant. He finished another smoke out of the pack, and I noticed that his fingers were trembling. We yelled his name for a while, and we didn't get no answer back. No one was too keen on going out in the dark to find this guy either. So now my nerves were just about screaming. Boy, and no one's making a goddamn sound. We're all just standing there with our guns pointed into an unknown with a block of ice in our guts. After a few minutes, your dad says, "Fuck, it's so quiet." And it was. There wasn't even a hint of a breeze in the air. Not one cricket chirping or an owl hooting off in the distance. It was just dead quiet. And the air felt strange and electric in my lungs. It felt like the way it did before the banger of a storm opens up in summertime. Like there's a hot, thick blanket laying on top of you. Air so thick you can almost cut it. We strained our eyes and ears into the woods around us, not breathing, not even blinking. And then we hear it. A howl that's like a tortured scream, demented and ferocious. The other French guy, what's his name? Well, he holds up this torch and yells, "Dare, over fucking dare, what is that ting?" And I hear something bulling its way through the underbush, coming at us fast and to the left. We all just blindly fired, just all out, let her fly. When the shooting tapered off, we listened for a minute or two, reloading with shaking hands, and the night was still just as silent as a morgue. All I could hear was my heart pounding. Finally, Frederick lets out a shaky little laugh and says, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what the hell was that thing? Did anyone tag the son of a..." And then that's when the howl howled again, this time right behind us. We spin around to face it, and for a split second, I saw the thing, a blurred impression of it, running in on us from yards away. I see something with a giant gangly body, a long face, and outstretched arms like broomsticks. We fired on it again, and it flipped backward through the air like an acrobat, bounced off a tree, and dove into the cover of the underbrush. My ears were ringing from gunfire. I yelled, "Where did the bastard go?" And Lewis starts shouting, "Over here, we got the fucker, we got him." And he runs over to where the thing has landed. We all holler at him, "No," but Lewis is already standing there, holding his torch up and looking around. He looks back at us and starts to say something, and then a huge spindly looking hand comes out of an oak tree above him and grabs him by the face. I mean, it grabbed his whole face and he started to scream, but it was muffled. And then I saw the hand clench hard around the Frenchman's head, and I heard the sound of bone splintering. Lois started spasming and beating at the long skinny arm above him. He was screaming and we were all screaming. And then the thing just yanks Lewis's body up into the tree. And this all happened in about the space of 4 seconds. I could see the disturbance in the branches as the cocksucker dragged poor Lewis up to the top with it. Jesus, he was screeching and making the most awful sounds all the way up the tree. We fired up after him and missed. Suddenly Lewis stops screaming and we hear something solid falling down from the tree, hitting branches and tumbling the whole way down. It teetered on the bottom branch for a second and then rolled off and landed in the mat of rotting leaves below. Your grandpa shines his flashlight at it and god damn it, did I ever retch. It was the Frenchman's head that had fallen out of the tree. Just his severed head. It was crushed into something that looked like a ruptured can of diced tomatoes. Our nerve broke. Then we ran. Even your dad, the war hero. We forgot all about Rudy lying there in his homemade stretcher. We forgot every damn thing and fucking ran. Hell yes. Blindly in separate directions, helter-skelter into the dark, and the Wendigo chased after us. Listening to this, I felt the blazing hot day had suddenly turned drastically chilly, and goose flesh broke out onto my arms. I lit another cigarette, and I was chain-smoking up a storm at this point. I was by myself, running like my ass was on fire. I heard bodies crashing through the bushes and saplings around me. Swearing, men calling out for God to save them. I ran, and bang! I ran headlong into a goddamn tree. Everything went numb and I blacked out for a few moments. When I came to, I was laying on my back on top of a picker bush, and my feet were still trying to run. There was sort of a buzzing sound in my ears, and I could dimly feel blood running down my face. I pulled myself off the picker bush and found my rifle laying in the weeds beside me. It was your grandpa's bolt-action .30-06. I got up with a pounding in my brain and a sick feeling in my guts, and all I could think was, oh fuck, it's behind me. So I whirl around and there's nothing there at all. Everyone had run off and I was all alone. The moon wasn't out yet, and I didn't even have a flashlight. Myself, I couldn't hardly see shit at all. I mostly felt my way around, walking through spider webs and stumbling over tree roots. I was soaked in sweat and starting to get a bit cold. All I wanted was to be at home, sipping a mug of Ma's hot cider, wrapped in a blanket by the fire. Lurching around in the dark like that probably wasn't getting me anywhere, but fear kept me going. I've never been so damned afraid in my life, I don't think. Not before that night or ever since. Every sound, every creak of a stirring branch or rustling of the dead leaves made me spin around with a .30-06 pointing at a wall of solid blackness. And I mean, it was dark out there. I could hardly see my hand outstretched in front of my face. My mind was playing all kinds of cruel tricks on my eyes. Every now and then I'd see a crescent head that would seem to lunge out of the dark, and I'd flinch back and almost piss my pants. But it wasn't nothing at all, but the outline of a bush or a clump of sumac hanging in the path. I was tripping over the ground and my own stupid feet a lot too. I'm actually kind of surprised I didn't blow my own head off. I don't know how long this went on, but eventually I hear my name being shouted. It was your dad. He and your grandpa came back to look for me. See, it's like I was telling you earlier. A man looks after his own, even if he's scared shitless and every instinct is urging him to run the hell away. A man still looks after his own. Well, I holler back at him that I'm over here, and I see a glint of your grandpa's flashlight through the trees, so I start shambling as fast as I could manage. I got maybe 20 steps before my toes hooked something, and I'm sprawling over onto my face. I could smell congealing blood, coppery and thick. I got up in a hurry and lit my Zippo to see really what it was, and Jesus, I had really just tripped over what was left of poor old Lewis. He was naked, save for his baggy undershorts, and his torso was hanging open like an unzipped jacket. All the guts had been ripped out of his body cavity. His flattened out head had been stuffed in there, and the eyes were gone. His face was frozen in a mask of agony and horror. I started screaming. Shit, I screamed so loud I almost blew the top right off the sky. And then there it was, stepping into the flickering glow of a Zippo on legs like twisted stilts. The Wendigo. It towered over me, and for one god-awful moment I saw it clearly. And I'm telling you here and now, it is an image that will forever be burned into my mind. The thing was skeletal, sexless. It was weirdly stretched looking, like an image in a funhouse mirror. Its hide appeared leathery and gray. Its face was long quarter moon. Its grinning mouth had dozens of sharp, crooked teeth. It didn't have any eyes or nose, no ears or any facial features at all, just a giant gaping mouth. Henry's lips twisted into a wry, humorless grin. You remember me saying earlier that every man has a time of 3 when he just freezes right up in the face of danger? It's a strange thing. Human nature is. My brother and father were risking an unspeakable death to come back for me. And there I was, rooted to the spot, too fucking scared to even move. Here's a bit of irony for you, though I'm convinced the same paralysis saved my hide that night. See, as the ugly bastard started leaning forward to grab me, I fainted and fell backward, and I can only guess what happened next, but I think as I hit the forest floor, my finger tightened on the trigger of the rifle, and I blew the top of the cocksucker's head clean off, point blank. The loud bang of the shot brought me around, and I opened my eyes to the sight of the Wendigo, caught in the beam of your grandfather's flashlight, squealing like a stuck hog and clawing at its head. Some sort of awful smelling black shit was pouring out of the gaping wound. The stuff smelled like sewage treatment plant mixed with a junkyard fire, just awful. And I've sometimes wondered if the thing didn't have concentrated evil instead of blood. It smelled that bad. I started yelling to just shoot the fucking thing. I jacked a fresh cartridge into the chamber and let her fly from where I was sprawled out on the ground. The shot went true and I punched a big hole into the fucker's midsection. A split second later, another shot booms out and the thing spins around with a good-sized chunk of its chest and back missing. The thing then staggered, almost fell, and then took off into the woods. We could hear it shrieking as it slammed and crashed its way through the bush. The Wendigo's screams haunt my nightmares for many years. You bet they did. Many, many years. Took the last few gulps of beer and I realized I was getting pretty drunk. Henry looked half into the bag too. I slurred, "Wow, Henry. Holy shit, I don't know what to say to any of that." Said, "Pfft," and flapped a hand at me, dropping a long ash into his lap and slopping a splash of his beer down while he did so. Hell, I probably wouldn't believe any of this either if I were you. I got a faded scar high up on my forehead from running into that tree. Here, see it? Other than that, there's really not any evidence that this ever happened. They made good and sure of that. What do you mean? Henry leaned forward and rested on his forearms. His voice was low and deliberate. He told me, "Well, you gotta hear the rest and then you'll understand." We finally made our way out of the woods around midnight. We popped out a few miles from Van Klein's orchard and started walking home. We ran into a search party a little spell down the road, just getting ready to head into the woods. There were a few local cops, a couple Mounties from the local station, and Willie himself. He got out okay, and when his wife had seen what a blubbering mess he was, when he got home, she immediately called the cops. Frederick was there too. The tough bastard managed to hobble his way out through the pitch black forest all alone, and eventually found himself on the road that borders the north side of the woods. The cops had found him. They were out patrolling because one of the local farmers had reported that someone was shooting the hell out of the woods in the middle of the night. The cops assumed it was poachers. Willie was just beside himself because he had left poor Rudy behind when we ran off. He had been in no condition to fend for himself at all, and he was worried about Bill too. We all were. Bill had long been a family friend of ours, and he was just a zany local character in general. Well liked, you know. He was at church every Sunday, and he was a member of the local Lions Club and Shriners. Shit, Billy had played the role of Santa Claus down in the community center Christmas Jamboree for so long, I couldn't remember him not doing it. Even the cops knew who he was, and they were worried for him too. Everyone liked Billy. He was just one of those guys. They found Rudy and the Frenchman before daybreak, safe and sound. But I don't know till a few days later because the cops took one look at me and said, "Take the young fella home, get him cleaned up and into bed. Whatever the hell happened out there, he's had enough of it." So they took me home, and your grandma lost her marbles on everyone at the state I was in. She wouldn't let your grandpa or dad leave again. Just made a hell of a fuss. She washed me up and kept asking me what happened out there. But what could I say to her that wouldn't sound crazy? So I just told her we got lost in the dark and that was it. And finally she gave up and put me to bed. I slept a lot for a few days. I guess I was in shock. I kept having reoccurring nightmares where I was running endlessly through a thick dark forest and the Wendigo was always just behind me. His claws kept hooking into the back of my shirt, and would feel his rotting breath as his mouth strained to clamp down on the back of my neck. When the morning came, that I finally decided to come downstairs, fully dressed and ready to go outside for a bit, I found the Mountie detective sitting at the kitchen table with Dad, sipping a mug of tea that Ma had brewed for him. He was even grimmer looking this time around, and he had dark circles underneath his eyes. He had me sit down beside your grandpa, and he said, "So you had a bad time the other night, I hear. Quite a mess. You shouldn't be poaching, and you shouldn't ever be doing it at night. It's a good way for a man to get killed, and I guess you found that out for yourselves, didn't you?" I told him that I didn't understand what he was talking about, and that I tried to go into what really happened that night, but the Mountie suddenly says, "Shut up, kid. Shut up and just listen. You too, Dad. I'm gonna fill you guys in on something. A little story that you aren't ever gonna read in the local papers, okay? A milkman discovered a body a couple days ago in Calton, naked, rusted in gore, and deader than a doornail. The milkman was doing his delivery to the house, and he thought he saw someone sprawled out on the kitchen floor through the garage door window. So straight away, he goes and contacts the police. Turns out that the man lying dead and mangled on his kitchen floor was one of the two missing people related to a very, very strange report from the other night. One that led to the search and rescue of 3 people. The dead man was a well-known person in these parts. His name was Bill Walsh. I froze, and so did your grandpa. I didn't understand at first. The detective says to us, Mr. Walsh had a top portion of his skull blown off, and he had suffered 2 gunshot wounds in his torso. He bled out and died. Thing is, there was hardly any blood on the kitchen floor, and none at all on the ceilings or walls. Not what you expect to find in a room where a man had been shot several times. However, what we did find were a few drips of splattered blood leading up the driveway and to the side door. It was all over the door and door handle. Lots of very clear palm and fingerprints to be had. And guess what? They all belong to the deceased. It looks for all the world as if Mr. Walsh was fatally gunshot somewhere, walked home while dying, let himself in, and collapsed onto his kitchen floor to breathe his last breath. Pretty damn strange, I'd say. How about you? I croaked out, "Yeah, strange," and trailed off. My brain was struggling trying to put it together. The Mountie says, "Yep, more than strange. Actually, later the same day, I went out to the very patch of woods that you guys were poaching in. Just, poking around, trying to put A and B together. Lo and behold, I found the other missing member of your little poaching party. He was dead. I saw what happened to him. I tried to keep a poker face, and it was a pretty damn bad one, I'll bet. Dad looked like he was about to start praying out loud. I say, Lewis, we lost him out there, and we were, poaching deer. We have no idea what became of that guy." And the detective gives me a thin smile and puts something on the table between us. It's my Zippo. He says I found this right near his body. Someone had dropped it while it was open and lit. It was pure luck that the damn thing didn't start a hell of a forest fire out there. I noticed that it had been inscribed, and the inscription reads, "To Henry with love." It's a fine lighter, and I'll be willing to bet it belongs to you, Henry. I'm willing to bet that if I were to dust the lighter for prints, yours would be all over it. He leaned in close and said, "You were there, and if I wanted to, I could run your ass in for questioning. Hard questioning. You know exactly what happened out there in the 55, don't you? All those guys that were out there in the woods that night, you all know the truth. I could see it in your faces that it's keeping you up at night." The detective got up and started pacing around the kitchen, his hands jammed deep in his pockets. He said, "The whole case has been under my skin from the start. Do you know what we found in Bill Walsh's house? Horrible things. Things of the likes of which I've never seen in my many years in uniform. We found bones in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. A lot of them. All of them human in origin. We had photos of his children being abused to the point of murder. Dozens of them, in fact. We found books about cannibalism, sacrilegious objects, more books about amoral medical practices, Satanism. There was a good deal of evidence that Mr. Walsh was a sick man and that he was doing horrible things on a regular basis." My sodden brain finally made the connection, and I gaped at Henry like a fish. "It was Bill?" Henry nodded and continued. "The Mountie says to us, I'm telling you men right now what I'm going to do. I'm shutting the case down. The local cops agree, not that they'd have a choice otherwise, but yeah, this is getting buried. The circus that it would create, shit. To hell with that. What happened, see, is this. The French fella, Louis, that was his name? Turns out he was a bad apple. I made a call to the RCMP headquarters in Quebec and got the story on this guy. He was a drifter who was a convicted child molester and habitual thief. His sexual preferences was the glue in his friendship with Bill the community man. I'd warrant. Anyways, it was a low-life son of a bitch who killed all those poor Indians out in the woods. Then, just by blind coincidence, or maybe the good Lord saw fit to have it happen, who knows, but all you boys were out poaching with him that night and you were all drinking and Louis accidentally got shot. Bad turn of events, but this sort of thing happens sometimes, doesn't it? Later that night, Bill Walsh went home and he shot himself. Maybe it was out of guilt for accidentally shooting his good pal Louis, who knows? He didn't leave a note. I tried to build a case against you guys, but all the farmers out this way are thick as thieves and every single one of you has an ironclad alibi. Folks were lying on your behalf and I couldn't gather enough evidence to arrest anyone. As for Louis, well, he didn't have any family to give a shit about his death, so he got a quick cremation down at the local funeral home where the remains are unmentioned. And that's what happened. Get it? Never speak the truth. Not ever again, understand? Let this wicked business die here and now. I asked him, what about all the stuff that you found at Bill's place? And he says with a straight face, oh hell, that burned down last night. Fire started in the fuse panel, I think. The house and everything in it is gone. He checked his pocket watch and then put on his hat and said to us, Walsh will be remembered as a good, upstanding citizen who died tragically, and that's fine by me. Better than the alternative, isn't it? Have a good day, gentlemen, and do yourselves a big favor. Whatever actually happened out there that night, try and forget about it. Henry stopped talking, and we sat in silence for a while. In the light of the day, with the corn stirring and a green wave from the breeze, the birds chasing each other around down the meadow below us, it should have been hard to accept Henry's story at face value, but it wasn't, because I could see the truth in his eyes. He had a steady, unapologetic gaze of a man who believes that what he is telling is the truth. Henry stood up and stretched. I heard his spine pop and his tendons creak. He looked over at his cornfield and said, we followed the cops' advice and tried our best to just kind of pretend that none of it ever happened. It was easier than what you'd think. The Van Kleins did their best to forget about all of it too, and as far as I know, we were pretty distant from each other after that night in the woods. I guess that it was just easier for us to forget it happened that way. We skipped going to Bill's funeral. There was really no fucking way any of us could have sat through that and not throw some sort of fit. A few months later, I had heard everyone had up and cleared out from the 55 at some point, pretty much overnight. I don't blame them one bit. It was just an abandoned circle of sagging old shacks for a few more years. Then a logging company came in and clear-cut a big swath of trees from there, and the 55 got plowed under to extend the trail. They were using it for a logging road. Henry considered another beer, then popped it open and drank. Time went by, and life went on as it always had. I got a job working in the train yard in the fall of '56. Paid good, and I eventually moved off the farm to be closer to work. One day I was out repairing a bit of track, and I see a hobo come up staggering to me. He looked completely out of his head on cheap booze, and I was wary of him. He comes up to me and says, it waits for me in my dreams. Some night it will get me, and all the cheap wine in the world won't stop it from eating me alive. Does it wait for you too? Do you wake up screaming? And suddenly I realized that the hobo's face was what's-his-face, the other Frenchman that had been with us on that awful night. I opened up my mouth to say something to him, and he just starts to shriek something in French at me, pulling out his own hair and jumping around like a spastic person as he did so. He ran off, and that was the last I saw of him. My mind was full of questions. I opened my mouth, then Henry cut me off. Corn looks good this year, don't it? Last year was a bad one, too dry. I ain't wasting my time irrigating, feeding corn, though. Hell no, I'll save it for the beans. Beans are gonna sell at record high this year, is what they're saying. This, as I know all too well, was Henry's way of saying that the story was over and we're done for now. Talked about crop rotation for a bit, and then decided it was time to go inside for some coffee and eat a bit. Just before we went in the house, Henry turned to me and said one last thing regarding the brush with the Wendigo. He said, it was a long fucking time before I went out into that particular patch of woods again. And ever since that night, I always sleep with a gun near my bed. Probably couldn't sleep without it. Every now and then, I still dream about it, you see. And when I wake up sweating and shaking, I reach out and touch the gun. Make sure it's still there. It's the only way I can get back to sleep again.